Hello and welcome to IMC Licensing's webinar, Restaurant Licensing 2010 Update. I'm Katie Rogers and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar, which will be hosted by IMC co-founders Stephen Riley, CEO, and Kara Bernofsky, President. If you have any questions during the presentation, please send them via the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen and make sure Q&A group is selected in the to box. The host will try to answer all of the questions in the allotted time at the end of the webinar. Thank you, and I'll now turn over to Stephen to start the program.
Good afternoon, everybody, or some of you, I think it's still late morning, but thanks for joining us today for an update on restaurant licensing in 2010. And just a quick word about what we mean by restaurant licensing. We're obviously talking about restaurants as brands that are licensed. So when the restaurant brand is being licensed, and today we're specifically talking about restaurant brands licensed into food and beverage categories. So there is restaurant licensing, restaurant brands on T-shirts and appliances, in a lot of other spaces. But we're talking about the place that's the most sensitive and most valuable for restaurant brands to license, and that's into other food products. Kara and I co-founded IMC Licensing. Many of you have met us over the years. Our specialty and our focus is in consumer packaged goods and consumer product brand licensing. We do a lot of work in food and beverage, and we've done a substantial amount of work with restaurant brands and with food companies that license restaurant brands. And what's really interesting to me is when Kara and I started this business, we didn't do work with restaurant brands. We couldn't get restaurant brands to talk to us, and there weren't much restaurant brand licensing. There wasn't much restaurant brand licensing going on at all. If we had given this seminar 12 years ago, it would have been a very short one indeed. So what Kara is going to talk about first, here's just some images of some of the largest brands of restaurants that are actively licensing into food and beverage categories. Kara is going to tell us why this webinar is so much more extensive now than it would have been 10 years ago.
So why would restaurant brands risk cannibalizing the restaurant business and their restaurant sales by offering consumers a chance to stay at home? And the reason is, quite frankly, because they are staying home. Restaurant sales have been in the steepest decline in 28 years. QSRs are down 2%. Casual is down 3%. And in a struggling economy, that's no surprise. Reports vary, and everybody has a prognostication of how quickly and when and how soon we're climbing our way out of this recession. But the one thing that savvy restaurant brand owners are realizing is that if consumers aren't eating in the restaurant, they are eating somewhere. And the savvy restaurant owners want a share of that stomach regardless of where the food is consumed. So they're looking at it as get the royalty dollars and the revenue now outside the restaurant. Stay connected with their consumers and their fans so that when the economy rebounds, their brand is fresh and top of mind, and they've maintained that strong connection with their consumers so that when they return, their brands are in favor with consumers. And what they've realized is that it really is a separate eating occasion, and even when times are good, there are going to be times when you want to eat at home, and there are going to be times when it's an eating out occasion, and how can their brands play a role in a variety of different types of eating occasions.
Kara and I have now worked through 2 recessions in the licensing industry, and while it's never anything we'd wish on an economy, in both times we've seen a silver lining for the licensing industry because it makes brand owners who previously resisted licensing because they thought they could afford to do without it suddenly very, very interested in incremental revenue building and then brand building through licensed consumer products.
And just as, from an anecdotal note, like Stephen said, years ago, we couldn't get anybody to take our call, and just anecdotally, we have gotten more calls from more restaurant brands in the past really year or two than ever before. I feel like there's a restaurant brand that we almost haven't talked to.
So that's how we're coming to present this talk. And what we're going to do first is we're just going to walk through a quick introduction to the prevalence of restaurant licensing in the supermarket especially. Many of you on this call are familiar, but for those who aren't, as with much licensing, it's more prevalent than you probably realize. So if we start in the snack aisle of the supermarket, that's a place where you can see Burger King and TGI Fridays very active through their license agreements with Inventure Foods, which we're going to talk about later. Cinnabon has been very active in this space with snack bars with a license through Kellogg's, a nut mix with Malachi, On the Border grills. In this category, one of the interesting things, you even see restaurant brands that are no longer in business, like Chi-Chi's, has a thriving snack food and salsa license with Hormel Foods, even though since its hepatitis scare in, I think, 2003 or 4, Chi-Chi's has not existed as a restaurant chain in the United States at all, but it lives on through its food licensing program. The beverage aisle is a very competitive space, but everybody wants to be there. Coffee, drinks, and with Rocky Mountain Chocolate or Wolfgang Puck, TGI Fridays with cocktail mixes, Jamba Juice and smoothie, Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts in coffee drinks as well as ground coffee, and Cinnabon have been active players in this space. It's very tough. Kara's going to talk about a few examples in more detail later. Condiments, which include sauces, marinades, and dressings, are a place that every restaurant owner is very interested in. They don't end up being very big categories, but they're categories where everybody's trying to gain a facing. Hooters has been in this space quite a while, fairly successfully. Famous Dave's, On the Border, others. All the steakhouses want to be here, but not everybody can really claim a long-term presence. Frozen desserts. The frozen aisle is probably the most concentrated aisle in the supermarket with licensing success stories. That's in spite of the fact that frozen novelties, which has long been an area dominated by licenses, is now almost completely, well, the licenses are considerably reduced. And I think the big players are evaluating and only paying for licenses at this point where they see huge benefits. But that said, Starbucks is active in frozen novelties and ice cream, Cinnabon with a Mrs. Smith's pie and a Schwan cheesecake, Jamba Juice and Marie Callender's with a very active license agreement with American Pie for frozen desserts. If we get into frozen meals, not all frozen meals, some shelf stable, but largely in meals, appetizers, entrees, and side dishes, TGI Fridays has been a phenomenal success in this space for over a decade. Boston Market, California Pizza Kitchen, again Wolfgang Puck, and Marie Callender's, a restaurant chain that is actually bigger in the supermarket than it is. It has only 130 stores on the ground, but is in almost every supermarket in America with its frozen meals and desserts. Kara's now going to go through case studies one by one and talk about some of the largest restaurant brands, not always the largest restaurant brands, but the largest restaurant brands in licensing.
And I want to start with TGI Fridays because I really think it's sort of the granddaddy in the restaurant brand space. Starting back in, I think, 1998 with its license with what was then Anchor Foods, introducing frozen appetizers. Fridays has gone on to build a substantial business in food brand licensing. Now, figures on everything aren't publicly available, but Inventure reports that approximately $80 million in retail sales of its snack food products. And while Heinz doesn't report, we think that between the frozen appetizers, skillet mills, the Inventure program, you're probably looking at a program that's about $500 million in retail sales. Significant, certainly, and a program that obviously isn't hurting TGI Fridays' restaurant business itself. In fact, it's just really endearing the franchise to its consumers.
Right. One of the interesting things, as Kara noted, is that some of these deals, again, we're talking about where the licensee is, in fact, a much bigger company than the restaurant brand owner. So some of the countries, the world's largest food companies, Nestle, Kraft, General Mills, Kellogg's, Campbell's Soup, all have Heinz, have individual thriving license programs, and they look in a very focused way at restaurant brands as a way, as equities that are really worth paying a royalty fee for. The Cinnabon brand, another interesting thing, so on the one hand we see licensees who are among the world's biggest food companies. On the other hand, we see a lot of food brands, restaurant brands that are owned by private equity firms. In the private equity boom of the last 10 years, and given the prolonged 30-year growth cycle of the quick-serve restaurant, what we call QSR sector as well as the casual dining sector, private equity firms saw restaurant chains, franchised restaurant businesses as phenomenal cash cows and growth vehicles that fit their business model of being able to acquire with a lot of leverage or debt, and then in 5 or 6 years be able to sell them for a lot more money. These private equity firms, because they were solely focused on the dollars, were already a little more receptive to licensing than the restaurant when the restaurant owners were owned by the restaurant brands were owned by their founders or by purely restaurant companies. The recession has made those private equity firms even more interested in licensing because all of a sudden they're faced with a mounting level of debt and increased uncertainty about whether or not they're going to be able to sell these restaurant chains for multiples of what they paid for them, and certainly whether they can do it in the time frame they've promised their limited partners or investors. Cinnabon is a strong success story in this space on its own, owned by Atlanta-based Focus Brands, which also owns Seattle's Best Coffee, as well as Carvel ice cream stores. Cinnabon, I think, just brilliantly took its ownership stake in the cinnamon flavor and was willing very boldly to go anywhere where cinnamon played. So whether it's breakfast snacks, bars with Kellogg's, a nationally licensed line of cinnamon bread in which Cinnabon actually partners with Sun-Made Raisins, which had already built a success story in the raisin bread. Again, a partnership with Schwann's for frozen desserts, or nuts with Malachi. Cinnabon has been a great success, and in fact, interestingly, is branching out its own brand and has actually launched its first line of gourmet cupcakes. So not necessarily cinnamon flavored, as it tries to figure out not only through licensing, but how for its core business it can continue to grow into the next decade.
We'll have to see if the future holds a cupcake licensing prospect there as they move forward on the cupcake front.
So Magnolia Bakery, watch out.
That's right. Now, Wolfgang Puck, there are a few people that I think have probably actually dined at Spago's or Pastrios or any of his high-end restaurants that are just in the toniest of locations. But through licensing, Wolfgang Puck has developed his brand and is able to reach a much broader base of consumers, both through his QSR restaurant concepts as well as some of his other licensed food products. Now, Wolfgang apparently goes to great lengths to try to make the products look as if they are done by him alone, but they are actually done through partnerships, even if it's not readily, if you're not able to readily figure that out on the product packaging. But for example, the Wolfgang Puck line of soup, stocks, and broths is actually done by Campbell's Soup Company, and the pizzas and frozen appetizers are done by Schwann's, and the coffee is done through a partnership with RDE LLC out of, I think, Washington. So, when you look at somebody like Wolfgang Puck, and this applies to not just Wolfgang Puck, but the other restaurant brands and chefs that are licensing, a question that we get frequently is, so what's the food going to taste like, and what are the recipes going to be, and what are the menu items that we should offer via licensing, and how does that work? How does that come to be? And what typically ends up happening is that perhaps the chef himself, or in many cases it's R&D or innovation, the test kitchen is working hand in hand with the licensee to develop signature recipes for the licensed products, and making sure that those products in their final formulation really deliver on the taste and the flavor and the level of quality that would be expected from that brand owner. If you're somebody like Wolfgang Puck, obviously you're not going to want to have product out there that tastes like a cheap pizza that you could buy for $1 in the freezer case. You want this to deliver a more upscale, premium product that consumers are feeling like they're going to get something special and worthy of Wolfgang Puck's name. So, and I just wanted to mention that in the development of these programs, obviously if consumers have some expectation, maybe not so much on a Wolfgang Puck because a lot of people haven't been to one of his restaurants, but on something like a TGI Fridays, people know what they expect from them. So those licensed products really need to be able to deliver. So there's an incredible amount of product development in order to make sure that those products do deliver as consumers would expect.
And one of the reasons we always thought it was a little strange that restaurant brands weren't doing more licensing was in fact that their entire business model was based on licensing. A franchise is a legally somewhat different from a license, but is about as close as you can get in the form of a contract. And it was always interesting to us that businesses built on franchising yet weren't willing to license. Wolfgang Puck's explosion in food licensing in the last few years has also coincided with what must be clearly a business plan to expand in all kinds of other ways, because surely all of those of you who travel as much as we do have seen expansion of Wolfgang Puck Expresses in airports. I walked by one in our convention center today, so he's clearly realized his brand needs to grow into large-scale opportunities, and I think doing a really good job. Dunkin' Brands, another company owned by a private equity consortium of Bain Capital, the Carlyle Group, and Thomas E. Lee Partners, is bought by the same group that had previously acquired Baskin-Robbins. So in some cases, these brands are growing together with a franchise model. Dunkin' Donuts, for those of you who don't live in the northeast of the United States, is known there primarily as a coffee shop, not just as a place for donuts. And Dunkin' Donuts did an absolutely brilliant deal with Procter & Gamble's Folgers division to license roasted coffee into supermarkets using the Dunkin' Donuts name. That allowed P&G to turn around what had been a completely stagnant division and then actually sell that division to Smucker's, which now partners with Procter & Gamble. And so together they share in growth in what had been a flat category, showing really at its best what a licensed restaurant brand can do in supermarkets, and obviously everyone feeling that consumers aren't making the choice to make Dunkin' Donuts coffee at home in a way that that stops them from going to Dunkin' Donuts on the road as well.
Now, Starbucks is a chain that has typically gone the joint venture route with its retail partners. For example, in packaged coffee with Kraft, with Pepsi, with the RTD Frappuccino and the iced coffees, those have been done through the joint venture route. More recently, probably about a year ago now, they used to have a joint venture with Dreyer's Nestle, and that has now converted to a license arrangement with Unilever. Unilever is actually also doing the Tazo tea, the ready-to-drink tea, with Unilever. I was going to mention here, so maybe we'll pause here for a second and just talk about the fact one of the licensed products that's not here anymore, there used to be a Starbucks liqueur done through Jim Beam, and that just sort of quietly went away, I think, in about 2008, and you didn't hear much about it going away after significant amount of press that it got when it launched a few years before that.
Exactly. Well, Starbucks can illustrates for licensees some of the risks of licensing a restaurant brand. Starbucks, of course, was on fire for 15 years nationally, and actually, so it brought an unusual amount of leverage to its agreements, as Kara said, was able to structure them as joint ventures rather than as pure license agreements, so retained a lot larger share of the profits. Presumably its deal with Jim Beam was structured in that way, as was its deal with Dreyer's Nestle for ice cream, and both of those deals, for the reasons we don't know everything about, but have both moved on, and Starbucks is forced to act like any old restaurant chain in its licensing program. Another interesting story is sometimes restaurant chains that are able to license beyond their footprint. So licensing, sometimes restaurant chains think differently about this. Years ago, we talked to Krispy Kreme when they were just expanding, and they were very wary about national licensing, which would reach consumers who did not yet have Krispy Kreme stores in their communities. We felt at that time, and still do, that the consumers were aware enough of the brand that they would actually view that as a positive. Jamba Juice has answered that question in a different way. In spite of a limited number of storefronts, and Jamba Juice has quickly sought to expand into supermarket food categories. I don't know everything about that. One of the factors may be that Jamba Juice itself has some limitations as a concept, so its way of actually capturing other usage occasions, other day parts, for consumers and other consumption places, it clearly can be accomplished through licensing. Second, Jamba Juice is a publicly traded company. Its stock has not been moving surely as much as its shareholders or institutional shareholders would like, and Jamba Juice has hired a new licensing professional and has declared that its licensing is now a strategic priority as a way to growth. Obviously, a lot less capital required to license quickly than elsewhere. Jamba Juice has not been entirely successful in its effort. It launched a liquid smoothie, ready-to-drink smoothie product with Nestle several years ago that has been quietly discontinued. That's the traditional way that licensed food products are discontinued. None of the press releases and fanfare that you get with their launch, and then all of a sudden you notice they're not on the shelf anymore. Nestle said something about production issues. There may have been quality concerns. Coke's Odwalla had a quality scare years ago, and obviously it may have been for that reason. It may be that it just wasn't selling at its price point. Adventure Foods has launched a frozen smoothie mix through its Raider Farms division. We had asked an executive from Adventure to join us. He wasn't able today, but they have built a very impressive business largely off of licensing, both with their Burger King and TGI Fridays snack food lines, as well as Jamba Juice. One of the things to point out here is we're disclosing only publicly available information. Obviously, we have some access to Nielsen data and otherwise, but are not in a position to be able to disclose that or information from any companies we've worked for in the past. But we're sharing pretty much whatever's out there in public. It's very hard to find out exactly what licensee sales are because even if they're a public company, they're not generally required to disclose the sales of individual lines in their business unless they make up more than 10% of their sales. So Adventure is small enough that the $40 million of wholesale business it does for TGI Fridays needs to be disclosed, but it doesn't need to disclose how much its sales are for Jamba Juice or for Burger King. The Oregon Ice Cream finally has launched a new line of sorbets and frozen novelties for Jamba Juice.
Boston Market is a company that's gone through some interesting undulations. Originally, Boston Market came out and it was Boston Chicken, and then they converted the name over to Boston Market probably in the mid-'90s to more accurately reflect the more diverse offering of foods in the in their retail locations. But back in 1998, Boston Market actually filed for bankruptcy, and shortly thereafter, in '99, Heinz Foods licensed Boston Market for a line of frozen entrees. So that program has now been in the market in grocer freezer cases for over a decade. And then in mid-2005, Boston Market came out with a line of ready-to-heat foods that are available in about 1,300 grocery locations. When you look at the number of Boston Market locations where you can actually go into the restaurants, there are only 530 locations in only 28 states. So again, this is a good example of a brand that's not available and that consumers are not interacting with in every state in the country through the restaurant locations, but they are through grocery stores. Stephen, we were talking about private equity companies. Boston Market back in 2007 was acquired by Sun Capital Partners, who has a host of other restaurant brands among its holdings, including Bruegger's and Fazoli's and Smoky Bones and Friendly's and other types of brands too. So just to your point about the number of private equity companies that own restaurant brands and how they might be looking at licensing to help build revenue for their brands.
Right.
Is interesting.
In this space, the meal section has been, obviously that's a place that moms and consumers go to, especially if they're replacing meals they might have bought otherwise in supermarkets. So to have a foothold in this space the way that Fridays and Boston Market do have been a very important positions and hard for anyone else to break into. Another restaurant chain, we think restaurants, sometimes are places where you get meals, but franchised restaurant concepts like Jamba Juice also include companies like Rocky Mountain Chocolate Factory, which is the largest chain of independent chocolate stores in the country with over 300 retail locations. Rocky Mountain, which is a client of ours, has extended its brand into flavored coffee with a company called White Coffee and a hot cocoa with Lehigh Roller Mills. We were able to work with the Rocky Mountain very early on. One of the key questions that comes up for restaurant brands, and I think all of the ones we're talking about in these case studies are predominantly franchised restaurant brands and concepts. A franchise business can't live without its franchisees, and franchisees are, for that reason, also especially sensitive to whatever the brand is doing, to market the brand in other ways. Franchisees have historically been extremely sensitive to licensing and especially to food licensing, without a lot of evidence, but they wield so much power in the franchisor-franchisee relationship that their opposition or questions alone have been reason enough in many cases to keep franchisors from licensing. In the case of Rocky Mountain, we worked through this in a very deliberate way, and our belief is that communication is the best way to license successfully as a restaurant brand without causing unnecessary tension with franchisees. Franchisees are very wary, especially about whether or not the brand owner, the franchisor, is doing something without their input. So we recommended, and Rocky Mountain executed, a communicate early and often strategy about its licensing program. One of the benefits in this case we were able to discuss and continue to work on is an opportunity for franchisees of this business to actually engage in selling the licensed product. So to some extent, we sold the licensing program as a free way to build out inventory and value add. So if someone's at the store buying chocolate, they could also, the franchisee might someday be able to sell hot chocolate as well. I think those two really got the franchisees on board. Of course, it is easier when you're in a narrower niche to understand why licensing is better. But I think that we're seeing more and more case studies, and in fact, that's why we've seen presentations like the one we're giving right now do a lot to get franchisors and their franchisees comfortable with the concept. And in fact, what we believe is the same thing we know is true from studies of food licensing elsewhere, that the more, and it's the only area of marketing where there really is that question, is that will more consumer interaction in the supermarket result in less consumer interaction at the restaurant? And what we believe, and studies have shown in other areas, is that more consumer interaction that's positive begets more consumer interaction. And so our belief is that there are very, very few cases where food licensing is not a valid concept for restaurant brands to undertake.
And we just have to be really deliberate about the packaging. I think a lot of the packaging, I know the Rocky Mountain Chocolate Factory that Stephen was just talking about, we're really deliberate to have something on the package that drives consumers to the retail locations. If they could talk about the story, about the experience that you get when you go to the restaurants and how the licensed products, deliver that at-home experience, but still encouraging consumers to go to the retail locations as well. That's the case with California Pizza Kitchen. This licensed product originally launched with Kraft back in 1999. Recently, when Kraft spun off its pizza business to Nestle, this program went with that. But again, just an example of the separate eating occasions of when you're having a pizza at home is a separate eating occasion than when you're going to go and sit down in a restaurant and have a pizza out. So just again, just another example of how you can capture consumers for different eating occasions. There's another one. We didn't include a case study in here, but I just wanted to mention because it's such recent news, but it's P.F. Chang's announcement recently with Unilever and their line of frozen entrees that they're going to be coming out with. So I'm excited to see what the packaging and how that product translates to the freezer case myself.
One of the interesting things is that even QSR restaurant brands, which may be in the restaurant world not at the top of the value chain or the most, aren't the most premium dining experiences, but in the supermarket they can reflect higher value options. So California Pizza Kitchen, and it's always important to think about what does a brand do for a licensee, because Kraft has a big enough, or had a big enough frozen pizza division that it wasn't paying a royalty to California Pizza Kitchen, and Schwann's wasn't paying a royalty to Wolfgang Puck just because it liked them. What these brands did for those companies was it allowed them to fill a price point that their existing lines of pizzas, so
right,
example,
it wasn't Tombstone or it wasn't DiGiorno, it was something at that premium price positioning.
So it's almost a flip, and it's one of the nice things that often in licensing, a brand has to get comfortable with maybe being a notch or two below where it exists in its core category. For a QSR brand, in fact, it sometimes gets to move upstairs as it moves into the supermarket. So that can make the sell of licensing a little easier than it is elsewhere. We're going to wrap up our time before we take questions by just talking about a few contract provisions. We could do this for much longer, but we often get some very basic questions we wanted to address how we tackle in the terms of the the license agreements for restaurant brand licensing.
One of the most popular questions we get is, what kind of royalty rates are charged? And, it can obviously vary on a variety of different factors, but sort of a good round ballpark royalty rate to pivot off of would be 5%. Again, it depends on a lot of different things, marketing and if there's an ingredient purchase or development that's going to go, that the licensor is bringing to the table as well. So that's just to give people a general sense. 5% is a good ballpark to start at. Guarantees and advances, we get a lot of questions about those, and they sort of go hand in hand oftentimes with performance hurdles, and what we're seeing a lot of now are staged in guarantees and advances that are based on hitting particular metrics of performance. So instead of, like we had in years past, where a licensee would sign a very rich licensing agreement that would have a very hefty advance and very hefty guaranteed minimums that would go for, the initial term of the agreement, which could be 3 to 5 years. What we're seeing now is that there is an advance upon signing. There's usually some sort of test period where a certain level of guarantee is due, but there are performance hurdles that will then trigger other guarantee payments and moving forward with the program on for the years to come. So
the interesting thing about performance hurdles is they can be as requested by either side at different times. So we've had situations where they weren't a particular concern beyond the guarantees to the licensor, but the licensee didn't want to be saddled with the agreement if they couldn't get the kind of distribution that would pay for it. And given we're talking about food licensing, so it's so dependent on the orders placed for buyers at literally a handful of retailers, from Kroger to Albertsons to Walmart. Obviously, a couple of larger regional chains can make a difference, like Publix or H-E-B in Texas, but a licensee doesn't want to do it. And on the other hand, we've had restaurant owners and we've had brand owners and restaurant brand owners who said, we don't want this program to go forward if it's not going to have national distribution. So we want we want a 60% ACV or distribution in supermarkets, or we're just going to back out of it. So the nice thing is sometimes performance hurdles can be how we can get both sides comfortable with the financial commitments and the risk they're taking, because they both realize they're not going to be in it for the long run if it's not a win-win. Quality control, obviously, much more than we can go into now. We have delivered entire webinars on that. We'd be happy to talk to somebody about it. What I'd like to do right now in our remaining 10 minutes or so is to answer some of the questions we've gotten. One of them is just said, is our company a broker? I guess basically the answer is yes. We're a middleman. We traditionally have more often represented the brand owner in building and implementing and managing licensing programs, but in many cases we have also represented manufacturers who are seeking brands that will make a difference for their business goals. So yes, we're right in the middle, as much of a broker as you can be.
We got a question here. What control does the licensor have over the program? Specifically, are there distribution limitations, pricing control, advertising requirements, et cetera? The answer is that the licensor does have a lot of control and works with the licensee very deliberately on what the go-to-market strategy is for the program. Ultimately, it's the licensee's responsibility to carry it out, but that strategy needs to be approved by the licensor. The licensor is going to want to know and have approval all the way from what the product tastes like, to what the packaging looks like, to what its positioning is in the store with pricing, any advertising and promotional support that the program gets. The licensor is typically very involved in the approval of such plans.
Another question has come in about assignment provisions. This is increasingly important. We haven't seen an especially busy merger and acquisition period because of the recession, but critically important, especially with so many private equity firms in the space. So they're very interested, if they've acquired manufacturers, that they be allowed to sell them if they have a license, and as well as the restaurant brand owners wanting to make sure that they can sell those brands. So it'd be very specific. What I'm talking about, Kara explained how Wolfgang Puck's soup business was sold by a company called Country Gourmet to Campbell's Soup. When that happened, obviously Wolfgang Puck, as the licensor, had to approve the assignment of that license agreement from one company to the other. When Anchor Foods was sold to Heinz, TGI Fridays had to approve the assignment of its license agreement. If you're the licensee, it's critically important that you be able to obtain that assignment approval. And to be honest, we're not sure. Licensees, some of them think more about that than others at the time of signing. There was a cookie company that was owned by a private equity firm that was the licensee for in-store cookies from Mrs. Fields, another restaurant brand that has been very active in licensing over the years. When the time came for that licensee to want another company to buy it, there had been some disagreements over various issues between the parties, but basically, as I understand it, the right to assign the agreement was denied by Mrs. Fields, and all of a sudden that company lost a lot of the value that it would have obtained through a sale. So I think attention to assignment is something that's there's more attention going to assignment provisions, but always think about that beforehand, because it's probably more likely to come up than you imagine. Right now we see some more sophisticated licensors among restaurant brands and food companies actually negotiating multiple options for the future of the license agreement, whether it's the fact that the licensor may actually have the right to purchase the licensee, whether they might have the right to turn the licensee into a co-packer, that is, have the licensee become a manufacturer. That's what Mrs. Fields did for its in-store cookies. It's been both a licensor and a distributor of its own cookies into supermarkets. And just think about all those different scenarios. You may not be able to resolve them up front, but if you can identify how people would be compensated, it makes licensors and licensees a lot less scared about entering into the agreement.
We have a question here about licensing within a restaurant setting, like a licensed dessert. And I assume that means something like Oreo blizzards or something like that. And, from what we know about working in that space, that typically has a couple of components. One is there's the royalty component for the use of the brand, but there's typically an ingredient sale that's involved with that. If you have, Oreo inclusions or Tabasco inclusions or Jack Daniel's inclusions or, a variety of different branded ingredients that are going into a menu item, oftentimes you're going to have an ingredient sale with that. And then another big piece of those programs typically ends up being the amount of marketing and advertising that's going to be supporting that licensed brand. And that can be pretty significant for brand owners, too. So really all three of those components are taken into consideration for those types of licenses that are menu items.
Probably the biggest, longest-lasting success in that realm involves a brand we've worked with, and it's the Jack Daniel's partnership with TGI Friday as the licensee. Friday with the Jack Daniel's Grill and the Jack Shrimp, Jack Chicken, has been able to actually do a tremendous amount, not only to reinforce the equity, Jack Daniel's equities that are associated with grilling and barbecuing, but in fact, because Fridays sells alcohol, is able to do a lot of good things for Jack Daniel's sales at TGI Fridays. At the same time, Fridays has had an enormous gain from that program because it was able to, built on the credibility and appeal of the Jack Daniel's brand, it was able to offer and get people to pay for much higher priced entrees on their menus than they had been paying previously for TGI Fridays standard menu entries. And so that's been a win-win in that space that's lasted, again, for well over 10 years. Do you want to do one more?
Do we have one more?
Well, we have a question about are there ingredient sales for licensed products? I think Kara just talked about that in her answer to restaurant setting licensing. And obviously there are. And you don't see that quite as much with restaurant brands as you do with food brands. So when the Oreo brand is licensed into food products, it customarily involves the sale of Oreos as ingredients to go into it. Oreo doesn't want to see a licensee using another cookie as substitute, and they want to get the revenue from that. The Tabasco brand, when it licenses into food, uses an ingredient sale as well. So again, there's no simple answer to how that's worked out, but there is typically a balancing act between the royalty rate, the ingredient sale, and other benefits, intangible benefits from the program. Examples of it in the restaurant space are not, there aren't that many, really. Brands like Mrs. Fields and Rocky Mountain have licensed into their space, but as far as I'm aware, haven't even had ingredient provisions in that. So sometimes flavoring is involved, but typically that's not provided by the licensor either.
Right. Well, I think that's what I think that was our last question.
I hope you all are as hungry as we are now.
Yes.
If you have any questions or would like to talk to us individually or with our others at our firm about restaurant licensing, food licensing, or any kind of licensing, please give us a call. Our contact information, I think, is about to come up. Or you can reach us on the web at imclicensing.com and find our phone number there. But we appreciate you joining us today and hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.